Let's look at some research topics in the field of language and communication to illustrate how you can use virtual reality as a research method to answer fundamental research questions. And our first example comes from research on prediction. So the fundamental research question that some researchers have had when studying language and communication is basically whether, if you're listening to me, are you implicitly, even without realizing it, predicting the words that I am going to say next? And this research is very much inspired by more observational research on turn-taking behavior. So the idea is that if you study people in their natural conversations, then typically one person is talking and then another person replies and then the other person replies again. And if you observe how much time there is between those turns, the turn of the speaker and the turn of the next speaker when they're having a conversation, it turns out that there's hardly any time between different turns. So this basically means that if we are having a conversation and I'm talking, at some point I will stop talking, hopefully, and then you will start talking, right, responding to me. If you look at those interactions in this way and look at how much time there is between my turn and your turn, it turns out that there's hardly any time in between turns. And this seems to be more or less the same in different languages. So here in this graph, you see sort of plots in different languages of how much time there is between different turns within a conversation. And this is more or less always around really 0 seconds. So there's hardly any time in between when I stop talking and when you start responding to me, if we're having a conversation. So this also means that this is kind of a mystery, right? So how is it possible that you already start talking right at the moment when I stop talking? Well, we also know that it takes some time to sort of mentally process what I'm telling you. So you need some time to really find the right words in your memory, the words that I'm uttering, to find the meaning of those words, to really understand what I'm saying. So one idea is, well, this is the case. People can really reply really quickly to another person because implicitly they're already predicting what words the speaker will utter next. So if you already more or less know how I'm going to end this sentence, you can already start preparing your response to me. And therefore, perhaps there's not a lot of time between my turn and your turn. There's this just very small gap between my turn and your turn on average. Right, so a nice example of observational research, this sort of raises a question, raises an additional question, it gives some nice theoretical insight and then at the same time raises a question. So the idea based on studying this, theorizing about this is that, well, perhaps people are predicting the end of a certain speaker's sentence such that they can start replying really quickly. And now, of course, this theory has been tested. So is it the case that we predict upcoming words? How can you test this? Well, for instance, you can place participants in front of a computer monitor. So they are sitting in the lab in front of a computer monitor and you show them scenes like the scene you see here of a boy in this case and 4 objects. So participants watch this scene on a computer screen and at the same time they listen to sentences that are presented to them via headphones. And those sentences could be sentences like, the boy will eat the cake. So imagine you're looking at this scene in on a computer screen in the lab, and you all of a sudden hear the sentence, the boy will eat the cake, in one condition. In a different condition, you will hear the sentence, the boy will move the cake. Well, it's the case here that the cake, in this case, is the only edible object. It's the only object you can eat, right? Normally, it's the only object that you should eat. So this you could call a restrictive sentence. So once you hear the verb eat, you more or less can be sure that the words the cake will follow because that's the only edible object here. In the unrestrictive condition, well, all those objects can be moved, right? So you more or less are not sure yet what will follow. Now, the idea is if you actually predict upcoming words, this must mean that as a participant in this experiment, you will actually be looking at this cake already before you hear the word cake in the restrictive condition. So once you hear the boy will eat, when you hear eat, you already can start looking at the cake because you more or less know this is what's going to follow. In the sentence, the boy will move, you're not sure what's going to follow, right? It can be any of those objects. So if you're predicting upcoming words, there must be an equal amount of eye gaze, looking at the cake versus looking at the train or the ball. It shouldn't be biased towards the cake already. And this is actually what has been observed in this kind of computer experiments. So here on top, you basically see more eye gaze, more eye movements, more looks at the cake after the word eat than after the word move. And those eye movements towards the cake were already there before the word cake was uttered. And this can then indirectly be taken as evidence that people predict upcoming words. So people hear a sentence like the boy will eat, and even before then they hear the word cake, they already start looking at the cake. So this is sort of evidence, okay, they probably predict that the word cake is going to follow, and that's why they already start looking at it. In the case of move, they won't look at the cake that much. They will look at the cake as much as they will look at other objects. Right, so this is eye tracking research. Participants in the lab are wearing an eye tracker, their eyes are being tracked, and you can analyze those data, and then you can find out, oh, people look more at the cake in the restrictive condition compared to the non-restrictive condition. So therefore, they must be predicting upcoming words. But you may also ask the question, well, this is all nice. Now we sort of know that people in the lab are predicting upcoming words. But of course, this is not very naturalistic, right? This is not as much, this doesn't look like everyday life as much as you would ideally want it. Everyday life doesn't look like this, right? You're not, when you're using language, you're not typically looking at a computer screen, sitting there just by yourself in a lab, looking at those 2D objects. It's also a bit cartoonish, right? And already this boy is looking at this cake. So perhaps therefore you're already looking more at this cake than at other objects. So can't we think of a sort of more natural way of answering the same question? Well, and there, of course, VR can come in. So you could also place participants not in front of a computer screen, but place them in front of those large screens in a cave environment. And then you can have them interact with a virtual agent who may say things like, well, today in this study, I'm going to give you a tour through my everyday life as a virtual agent. And we sort of jointly visit a lot of locations that are important to me in my life. And one of those locations could be, for instance, an office setting. So she would be saying things like, well, this is the office where I work. And this is where I go on work days, and I work here, and this is my job, etc. And then also in this rich, much richer environment compared to this computer screen, there can also be all sorts of objects. So here on this office table, you might, for instance, see this cup of coffee there, right? Or there's a newspaper, or there's a laptop. And while she's talking, she may say things like, my colleague always drinks a cup of coffee in the morning. And then actually, again, this verb form drinks is actually restrictive, right? Because there's only one drinkable object, drinkable entity in this scene, which is this cup of coffee. It's the coffee in the cup. Right, so then the idea is, if you again track people's eye movements, will they start looking at this cup of coffee once they hear the verb form drink, but before they hear cup of coffee? If they do, then again, you can take this as evidence that people apparently are predicting upcoming words, especially if you compare this to a condition where she says, my colleague always brings a cup of coffee in the morning. Because once you hear bring, it can be anything, right? The colleague might bring the newspaper, or might bring a muffin that you see there. So you don't know yet that a cup of coffee will follow. So the idea is, if you predict upcoming words, you hear the verb form drinks, and you find out that people's eyes then immediately move to the cup of coffee, even before you hear the words cup of coffee, then apparently they are predicting upcoming words, also in those much richer environments that more or less look a bit more like everyday situations, because they're 3D, because there are many more things going on, because participants are a bit more involved, perhaps. Well, and this is actually what is found in this study that was led by Evelien Heijselaar. So here in the graph, on the left, you see that already before the onset of the noun, so here the noun is cup of coffee, more eye gaze, more participants' eye gaze, more looks go towards this cup of coffee, even before they hear this word cup of coffee, after having heard drink. So in general, they look a lot at this virtual agent, which makes a lot of sense, right? Because if someone's talking to you, you typically look at that person. But if they then hear drink, they start moving their eyes towards the cup of coffee. And in the graph on the right, you see that they don't do this when they hear the verb form bring, because then actually you can't really tell, right, what's going to follow. It can be different things. So people are not yet looking really at this cup of coffee compared to this restrictive condition. So, right, long story, but this can be then taken as evidence that also in richer dynamic situations, apparently participants, people, predict upcoming words when they're listening to someone. And this might then also explain why those gaps between different turns in everyday life are actually quite short. If you're predicting what's following next, you can already sort of start preparing your answer to what someone is saying.